Okay, so getting into chapter 2 here, we're going to talk about the political and part of the legal environment today, and we're going to talk a little bit in the next lecture about finish up with the legal environment and then talk about some technologies that are really shaping globalization. So, in chapter 2, what we're going to do is talk about ideologies and political systems and give brief examples of the kind of countries that employ those ideologies and political systems. And then we're also going to get into kind of the legal environment and how that influences regulations. So, to start, we want to see the big picture here of the political environment. And the way that I want to break it down is into kind of two areas. The first area is ideologies, to talk about what those are and learn about those, and then political systems, what those are. And so, basically, what an ideology is it's the ideas and beliefs and values of a particular culture. Usually, it's a national type of belief, and what that does is essentially forms how people think in a nation, and then people think differently from each other depending on what their ideology is across nations. And so we're interested in ideology because it explains why people behave the way they do, most importantly, why governments behave the way that they do. So that is an issue that we're going to get into with ideology. Now, political system is based upon ideology somewhat, but it's really the enactment of the people's will. And the way that we're going to kind of delineate a political system is to look at two basic options. First are the rights of the citizens, what they can do, and how they can kind of form a government. And then what is the focus? Is the focus for individuals and their rights to be protected, or is the focus for the nation at large, to do the most good for the most amount of people in a nation? So we'll get into that. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is as I go across these ideas and constructs, that they're not black and white, they're not left and right. They merge and they're linear, and nations have a bit of each of these. So don't think of them as these pure forms of government. Okay. So first, when we talk about ideology, we want to talk about individualism, and individualism is something the United States is very strong in. It's a very strong ideology. But as I'll mention in a second, we still have some collectivism and socialism in our country, because there's no pure form of individualism out there. But we are one of the most individualistic countries. And basically, what individualism is that it's an ideology that says people should be free to pursue whatever economic or political endeavors that they want to do. You can do what you want to do. You can become what you want to become, and you can run for office if you want to. And in the business context, the way that we think about that is capitalism. We refer to that as capitalism, and have a free market. You can get into whatever business you want. You can sell whatever you want. You can set whatever prices you want. Now, linked to that idea of freedom of the individual is this idea of private property. An individual can buy property and own it and keep other people off of it, and they can have it for themselves. And the reason this ideology of private property is so important is because, along with capitalism and individualism, what private property suggests is it's a more productive and successful use for property than to have communal property. And more importantly, the overall implication for this class for individualism is that what societies that are individualistic believe is that they believe by any person pursuing their own freedom and their economic wealth that they better society. So, stated another way, when you become rich, according to individualistic ideology, that makes everyone else better off in the society. So, because Mark Zuckerberg is worth $50 billion, he started Facebook, that's a good thing, because that value that he's worth, that 50 billion, it created even more value for the rest of society. Okay, that's what individualism is. And to kind of bring that point home, I love to show this slide right here. And this is what CEOs make. as far as a multiple of what the average worker at their company makes. So to state that another way, the CEOs in Japan, they make about 10 times what their average worker at their company makes. So CEOs aren't paid a whole lot more compared to the average worker, just 10 times more. And you see Germany's similar, France is similar, Mexico, CEOs get paid about 50 times more. In Brazil, about 60 times more than the average worker of that company. So you see that sort of range, and I always like to ask, okay, where do you think the United States is on this graph? You think they're below this or below 100? And people are usually shocked when I show that actually much, much higher. In fact, the USA pays on average the CEOs about 500 times what the average worker at that company makes. So CEOs are paid incredibly well in the United States. And the reason that I talk about this is because not because it's good, not because it's bad, but because we're okay with it. You don't see people marching in the streets upset that CEOs make so much more than workers at their companies. It's because we're an individualistic country. We accept this as reality. We accept that you make what the market tells you can make. And there it is right there, in graphical form. So switching gears to a different type of ideology is collectivism. Collectivism does not see importance with the individual, so to speak. What's more important with collectivism is the goals of society at large. And they're more important than any individual rights that people have. In this country, we protect the rights of the minority, even if most people don't like those rights. You're still allowed to do it. And so that's not what collectivism is. Collectivism is about setting goals for the society and rights in the society that make most people happy and that do the most good for the most amount of people. And collectivism can take many different forms. There's a lot of different things because it depends on what the goal of the collectivist society is. Is it to have a strong military? Is it to have strong corporations? Is it to love the country more? So collectivism is much more varied than individualism. And to kind of show that, I like to talk about nationalism. And this is when the nation, the political ideology that you identify with the nation and what the nation does, and there's one way to kind of be a patriot or to be patriotic is really important. And that's what fascism is, that's what nationalism is, and it's the belief that your country is the most important thing and that it's naturally superior to other countries, and that there is an identity that you need to respect. If you're part of that country, you should do this. And see, that's where, even though in the United States it's very individualistic, what we see is we're also partly a nationalistic country. I think that last year, a couple years ago, there were some NFL players who would take a knee during the national anthem. And that became a huge, huge issue for the NFL because many, many people didn't like it. Is it their right to take a knee during the national anthem? Of course it is. We're an individualistic country. Yet many people saw it as bad and disrespectful because it suggested that we didn't have a good nation or didn't respect the nation or that it was a protest against the military, which is a national institution. So we have that strain of nationalism that runs really strong in our country. So there's no pure form of any of these that I'm talking about here, even with the United States. So the third ideology that I want you guys to know is socialism. And socialism is basically not about the individual, not about the group, it's about the government. And the government owns all the institutions. And more importantly, no such thing as private property and no such thing as profit. You don't have profit. Profit is seen as bad. That's not why not why institutions exist, to make money. In capitalism, that's exactly why they exist, is to make money. In socialistic countries, no, they don't. And so we see this definitely in North Korea and Cuba, starting to see it a little bit more in Venezuela. Starting to see it. We see it in China and in certain parts of the country, we don't see it. But socialism is not always that extreme. That's what we tend to think of as communism. But communism is an extreme form of socialism. We see kind of minor forms of socialism including Great Britain's Labour Party, and there's other parties in France, Spain, and Greece, and even in this country. We have socialism as far as some of the health care and Medicare that we provide, as far as um, Social Security, those sorts of things are socialistic in nature. So I want to turn now to political systems and talk about a couple different ways that you enact ideologies based on that. And the first political system I want to talk about is democracy, and that is a system with European roots, very very old system, going back to the Greeks and Romans, in which government is controlled by citizens. It's either controlled by citizens day to day directly or through elections where you vote on representatives who then control the political system. The most important part about democratic societies is that you have to have at least two parties. You can't have a democracy if only one party is on the ballot, because then you don't have anybody else to vote for. So you got to have at least two parties. Voting does not make you a democracy. Having multiple parties is what makes you a democracy, and we'll talk about that in class, about how in certain countries like Cuba and Russia and Venezuela, they say that they're democracies, but when you look at who people actually vote for, they can only vote for the person who's already in charge. And most importantly about democracy, not just that there's multiple parties, but that once elected, the representative is held accountable with another election and after some time period. So you don't just serve forever. You have to be held accountable by the people that put you there. So totalitarianism is completely different, is the opposite of democracy, and that's when only one party rules and one party has control over all facets of life. And this is generally how most nations since civilizations have begun have existed. Democracy is actually pretty rare. Most nation states throughout time have been totalitarian, and power is maintained by suppression of the opposition is actually seen as an ideal. In totalitarian systems, we're not used to these, but most of the rest of the world is, and in history they have been. But it's the idea that you cannot oppose whoever's in charge. And the media shouldn't be allowed to write whatever they want to write because that's seen as an attack. You can't have representatives of different political parties, and even to deny people rights and liberties that have anything to do with opposing this single party. All those things are seen as bad. We that's the exact opposite of what we have in the United States. But it's very interesting to think about that. And one of the questions that I'm going to ask in class is, are there advantages of this system? We tend to be very hung up in democracy in this country, but are there disadvantages of democracy, and are there advantages of totalitarianism? We'll talk about that. So I want to discuss a few different political environments, being specific here. We're going to get into China a little bit more in class, but basically China has opened up their society somewhat to be more democratic, more capitalistic. But what you see is there's special regions in China where people can have capitalism and own private property, and then the rest of China is basically very communist, very socialist, very totalitarian. So basically you have Shanghai and Hong Kong and a few other coastal cities to where markets kind of act almost like they're free market, but you go 100 miles inland and it's completely different. It's like how China used to be 50 years ago. And so what China's trying to do is to hold fast to their ideologies, their totalitarian and socialistic ideologies, while also trying to have a more dynamic market economy. They're trying to really balance two things that haven't been balanced very well in the past. And then we also see the European Union, and we're really seeing the European Union kind of struggle since they reached their peak a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago. They've become much more open to trade. They've become much more privatized. But the problem with the European Union is essentially that they have large interwoven region that's economically linked, but is not politically linked. and has very, very different cultures. Okay, and they share the same type of monetary system, and the euro is worth the same no matter where you go in Europe. But you have really, really strong economies and really, really weak economies in Europe. Yet the kind of money is the same that they use, and that creates major problems. And I'm going to walk you through an issue here that I think is really, really interesting. So a lot of you may not know this, but in the United States, very rich states like California, Connecticut, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York, people pay taxes at the federal level, and they all go to a federal bank. Let's just pretend that there's a bank out there. And then that bank divvies the money back out to the states based on how much health care is needed, how much education is needed, how much highways are needed, how much anything that's infrastructure related that the federal government does. Okay, and they dish it back out. What a lot of people don't realize is that in the very rich states, these 5 states right here make up just 30%, make up almost a third of the U.S. GDP. California, Connecticut, Illinois, New Jersey, New York. For every dollar that these states pay, they only get back about 75 cents of the money that they paid in federal form. So where does that other quarter go? Is it wasted? What happens to it? Well, here's what happens. It goes to the poor states. It goes to a state like Missouri. It goes to a state like Tennessee, a state like Louisiana, a state like Kansas, where these people pay $1 in Missouri, and what they get back from the federal government is $1.33. Or these people in Tennessee pay $1, and what they get back in federal funds is almost $1.30. So what you see is fiscal transfers between the states. Now, do you know about this? Do you hear about it? No, because it happens at the federal level. This is exactly what does not happen in the European Union. So your very, very rich states, the countries that almost account for a third of the economy, like Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Finland, what they pay into the European Union, they keep because the money doesn't go outside of their own country. But if they were able to give money to Portugal in the same rate that California gives money to Missouri, or Austria was able to give money to Greece in the same way that Illinois gives to Tennessee, all of the problems in the European Union would be solved. But there's a big issue here. People in Germany, people in Netherlands, people in Austria don't want to pay 75 cents on the dollar and give away a quarter to Portugal and Greece. And that's why countries like Portugal and Greece and Ireland are in such dire financial straits. And it's not why Missouri, Tennessee, and Kansas are in such financial straits. Just because the rich are given to the poor in our federal system, and in the European Union, the rich do not give to the poor and create inequality, which really hurts the euro over the long run. So a couple other things about different political environments here. Talk about the Middle East. The Middle East has very interesting laws that don't overlap a lot with the way that Westerners do business. However, many Middle Easterners have gone to business schools in Western civilizations and know how to conduct business in Western ways. So business is conducted in a Western way, but the laws are very different. So you kind of have a two-pronged system there in the Middle East, and we'll talk more about that in class. And Russia's an interesting one too. Russia has seen tons of changes in their political environment. They went from communism to just crazy capitalism that created a bunch of oligarchs, and now they're back into totalitarianism with Putin, who's been in power for almost 20 years now. I'm going to talk about why it's difficult to get him out of power, and what the motivations are to kind of disrupt the Western economies and Western powerhouses for Russia, and where that corruption comes from. And before I get into the legal and regulatory environment, we'll stop there and have that pick up in lecture 2.